can AI ever be conscious?
This is how immortality can happen, that you can scan somebody's brain and upload their essence into a computer world where they can exist. There will be a point where humans and machines will meld, and we will give away our physical bodies and effectively become immortal.
There are parallel universes.
There are multiple universes, billions of universes, which means that every outcome of every decision you can possibly make is already there in one of the universes. There will be a version of you that will do everything that you can technically do in your life.
Do you think we are living in a simulation?
At the moment of death, you can live your life 1,000,000 times in the final second of your life because you're in a different form of time. We have multiple lives, and this is a simulation.
Thank you so much for coming on to Under the Tree. This is going to be a fascinating conversation, especially because our audience is very interested in really the merging of Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy, and really just diving deep into the ultimate truth of life. Just a couple months back, we featured Swami Sivapriyananda. He's a minister at the Vedanta Society of New York, and he talks a lot about Advaita Vedanta. And when I've listened to a lot of your talks, and I can see that there is a lot of similarities. So I would love to kind of dive into that as well. But what I do want to start talking about is this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. Is the hard problem of consciousness, which was coined by David Chalmers. And when I first found out what this is, I just started asking myself that, wait, I'm drinking this cup of coffee and I'm getting this type, this taste that it's, bitter or it's sweet or whatever. And someone else is drinking that same coffee and they're getting different feelings inside. And that made me wonder that, right, how can just some neurons communicating with one another really produce that subjective experience? So I want your views on that, first of all.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because one of my favorite neurologists, neuroscientists, is a guy called Ramachandran, R.V. Ramachandran. And one of the things he points out is about the concept of qualia, that is the flavor of something, or the taste or the brightness of something. And he turns around and he says, what is creating that taste of paneer that my tongue is tasting? How is that happening? And of course, the big mystery here is what's called qualia. This is the idea that there isn't the sensations we have, but those sensations are located nowhere. And it's a very difficult concept to get across to people, that I genuinely believe that some people are really intrigued by the mystery of just being, the ontological mystery of what it is to be. Whereas the vast majority of human beings never even think about it. They don't even get the question. They don't even understand when I turn around and I say that red does not exist. They look at me as if I'm completely insane. And the question and the answer is that red does not exist. Red does not exist anywhere. Neither does green, neither does the flavor of curry. These are all things that are effectively stimulations of your senses that your brain interprets in a particular way and presents it to consciousness. And this was the big question that, you mentioned, sort of David Chalmers, 1994, I think it was, at the University of Arizona, stood up and said, there are two big questions of science. There's the soft question, which is basically how the brain functions. But the hard question is, how does inanimate matter, as I've said, reacting with chemicals, create a consciousness that has hopes and fears and memories and feelings? And why is it such a waste that consciousness exists for a few short years, appears from nowhere, exists for a few short years, and then disappears back nowhere? As I once said, it's like just once something existed for an eternity, existed for a tiny minute amount of time and disappeared again. It makes no sense. Now you could...
Yeah, I was saying that in the age we are right now, where artificial intelligence is just booming, that entire question of can AI ever be conscious, right? If it's about brain function or some type of scientific, procedures that are happening, can artificial intelligence or robots ever be coded to be conscious? So you can continue from where you were.
Yeah,
but
because basically what you're touching on here is a very interesting point, and I work with people who are working with artificial intelligence, and I've known about the implications of it for quite a time. And one of the things that this brings up is, what is consciousness? And there's consciousness, and then there's self-aware consciousness, then there's referential self-aware consciousness. So there's different levels of consciousness anyway. But we have to think about this. Now, for example, it's something called a substrate problem. The idea is, if I was able to scan your brain down to the molecular level, and then I was able to upload that data into a computer, would that be you? And most people's reaction would be no, because you've updated the data and the information, but you haven't updated the essence of what makes somebody consciously aware. But because we don't know what triggers consciousness in the first place, well, if we only take a materialist reductionist Daniel Dennett type viewpoint of consciousness, the consciousness is literally just an epiphenomenon of brain reactions. Again, it's chemicals reacting with electricity in the brain. But how does that even begin to explain the taste of ice cream? Where does it even start to explain how the smell of a rose? You can't. These are different qualities. And in order to be conscious, you have to be in some way aware of these things. But who knows? It could be that there is a certain point of complexity where things become conscious. But the thing is, how can we ever know? There's this thing called the Turing test, isn't there? Where you can ask certain questions.
To a robot or AI, and to see if it kind of communicates like a human. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, but it is. It's effectively certain questions, that there's certain responses as to whether you know. And I think it was Searle, John Searle came up with the Chinese puzzle thought experiment, which is basically, again, how could you ever know that you were being responded to by a machine or by a human being? Now, this was years ago he did this. Imagine now with AI, and I know friends of mine that talk to their AI bots, and they genuinely believe that they're conscious because they learn, they remember what you said to them last time, they seem to show emotion, they seem to show self-awareness in the way they answer their questions. So we're in a really interesting time here, because there is there's the concept, isn't there? Is it Ray Kurzweil, who has a concept where he says that something called I can't remember the term he uses now. I don't know. Do you know the work of Ray Kurzweil at all?
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay.
Write it down about her.
It's something like the totality. It's not, but it's something like that. And he argues that there will be a point where humans and machines will meld, that they will become sentient, and we will become sentient, and we will give away our physical bodies and effectively become immortal. But this is one of the questions I address in my book on near-death experiences, my book on cheating the ferryman, my previous book, where I argue, well, if you did do this, would that be you? Because it's taking, there's a guy called Eric Steinhardt, who is a theologian in New York. I think Eric came to one of my talks around about 20 years ago in New York. And he's arguing that this is how immortality can happen, that you can scan somebody's brain and upload their essence into a computer world where they can exist. Now, we know, we put a virtual reality headset on. And for example, I've suggested this before, posit an idea that you could be uploaded into a virtual reality equivalent of your life, interfacing with everybody you know in the same way as you do, with an image that looks like you when you see your reflection in a mirror in the virtual reality. And what you're doing is you are in a haptic suit that reproduces your movements here in the simulation. and then your memory's wiped. How would you know that you weren't in a simulation? And the answer is you couldn't.
Do you think we are living in a simulation right now?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do. But I think it's more subtle than that. I have a concept called cheating the ferryman. And in cheating the ferryman, I'm suggesting that we are all living, again, like I asked your brother earlier on, do you get deja vu sensations?
Yes, and in fact, it's sometimes like it happens in weird times. Like sometimes maybe I'm in a room and just like I've seen this before. This has happened before, and then I don't understand it.
Do you have precognitive deja vus? Do you know what's going to happen next?
Yeah, like are you talking about intuition or a little
No,
bit?
the feeling, that you recognize the set of circumstances you're in, and then you know what somebody's going to say to you next, for example.
Yes, yeah, almost as if it's happened before, like that duplicate situation. It's happened exactly the way it's about to happen. Yes.
Yeah, now because this is very interesting. I mean, I differentiate two types. There's deja vu, and it's not my original terminology. It's the terminology of a guy called Arthur Funkhauser, Dr. Arthur Funkhauser, who's an associate of mine. But basically, he has a concept called déjà vécu, which is already lived. And it's much more accurate. It's the idea that you're living something you've experienced sometime in your past, but you don't know when. And indeed, what's the guy's name? There's a guy that's based in Seattle who wrote the definitive book on deja vu. His name will come back to me. And he came up with a definition that a deja vu is a memory of something that has happened, or a recollection of something that's happened at an indeterminate time in your past. And that is so important, because when people turn around and say it's deja vu over and over again, that is not deja vu. If you recognize the set of circumstances and you remember the previous set of circumstances, that is categorically not deja vu. Deja vu is when you come across a set of circumstances and you don't know when you last experienced that set of circumstances.
And when you mean past lives, you mean that we have had in the past that we've lived before, or we've been on this planet before, or do you mean past?
There are two interpretations here, and my interpretation is that you have lived your life before as you, because people turn around and say that deja vu sensations are evidence of reincarnation, and they're evidence of the idea that you are in a place that you recognize from a previous life that you'd experienced as somebody else. Yeah. Now, my counter argument to this is, if a deja vu was that, the circumstances would not be identical to the circumstances you find yourself in now. You'd be wearing different clothes. Your environment would be different. The fashions would be different. The furniture would be different. But it is a direct facsimile of what you experienced before. So if it was literally proof of reincarnation, it wouldn't be a deja vu sensation. It would be a recognition maybe of the environment around you, but not the incident, not everything that's there. And I argue this is because reincarnation is effectively being reborn again as a different person, going from one transmigration of soul, from one unique life to another unique life with no transference of memory. My hypothesis, which is cheating the ferryman, is that we live our lives again multiple times, maybe countless times, like Connors does in Groundhog Day. You live the same day, interface probably with the same people, but every day is different, because your actions from the previous day create the outcomes of the next day. Because remember, Connors in Groundhog Day, every day is different for him. Right. And of course, because he's reacting differently to the day before, everybody else reacts differently. So it's very subtle. So my cheating the ferryman hypothesis argues we live our lives again. And this is why you have the recognition under certain circumstances, because you subliminally remember those set of circumstances. Now, this could be because your consciousness is open to what I call demonic memory. And demonic memory is effectively the memory residing in your non-dominant hemisphere of the brain. And it's the memory that carries forward from life to life. And the entity that is that consciousness, I call the daemon. And the daemon is the universal you. The daemon is your spirit guide, for want of a better term, or using modern terminology, it's your game player. So if your life
Yeah, I'm going to forget this. I want to definitely pinpoint something. So with your theory of us kind of taking multiple lives and coming back, and we've had past lives before. So my question is that why are we taking multiple lives? Like, okay, if we had the situation before, we've lived before, why did we die and decide to come back again and relive it? Did we come here to evolve in some sense, or realize our true potential? What is the reason behind that?
It's evolving. And in many ways, it's evolving in exactly the same way that many Eastern religions argue that reincarnation works. Because reincarnation works in order for you to become a Buddha, to become a bodhisattva, a perfect being. Now, I use the analogy of Groundhog Day, the movie, because it's a perfect analogy for me. And I've interviewed Danny Rubin, the guy that did Groundhog Day, the guy that wrote it, on my own podcast. And interestingly enough, Danny, when he discovered my work, bought copies of my first book to everybody he knew, because he said, this guy's done the science of Groundhog Day. So what takes place in Groundhog Day is a very quick synopsis for the people that haven't seen it. It takes place on one day in February in Punxsutawney in Pennsylvania, when every year people expect Punxsutawney Phil, who's a little groundhog, either pops his head out or he doesn't. And if he doesn't pop his head out, it means the winter's going to last longer. So it means lots of weathermen go down there to do it. And it's a fictional story, but one of the weathermen is a guy called Phil Connors. And Connors is interested in one of his production assistants, quite fancy, so. And that is the setup. So he gets up on the first day and he wakes up to hearing Sonny and Cher's song, I've Got You, Babe, on the radio. He goes downstairs and he has breakfast, and the day pans through as a normal day would. Then he goes to sleep. The next day he wakes up and Sonny and Cher is on the radio again. And he thinks the radio station has got it wrong. He goes downstairs and Mrs. Danvers, I think it is, who's the lady that owns the bed and breakfast, says the same words to him that she said the previous morning. Right. And he's confused by this. And then he turns around to her and he makes this wonderful line, typical Danny Rubin line, where he turns around and he says, Mrs. Danvers, have you ever got deja vu? And she turns around and she says, no, I'm not sure. I'll check with the chef and see if we've got any in the kitchen, because she thinks he's ordering food. And what happens is he realizes, he gets through that day and he's confused. And then he wakes up the next day and he hears Sonny and Cher and the same things happen. And he realizes he's living the same day over and over again. And over many days, he decides this is so awful. He tries to kill himself, tries various ways of killing himself, still wakes up the next morning. Lots of comedic things about that. But then he starts to develop. He starts to realize that he's got power here. He knows the things that other people don't know. And he knows how the day's going to pan out. So he uses his knowledge of the previous day in the next day. So he fancies the girl. So what he does is he asks her what her favorite books are. So next time when he takes her out, he says, do you know what? I really love this book. And she goes, wow, we have got so much in common. But then he's doing it for selfish reasons. So then over the days, he then grows a little bit and realizes he can educate himself. So he teaches himself how to play the piano. He teaches himself foreign languages. He does all these things to educate himself, as if he's progressed and he's a bigger human being, a more developed human being. But then as it gets to the end of the movie, do you remember, he then uses the information he's got to save people's lives and help people. And he's running around the town. He's underneath the tree to help the little boy who falls out the tree. He tries to save the tramp's life, does various good things. Which means effectively he's becoming a Buddha. He's becoming a bodhisattva. He's becoming an inwardly knowing person. Now, I argue, and remember at the end, he's then suddenly allowed to move forward. I argue this is what cheating the ferryman is. I argue that this is what happens in the near-death experience. We live our lives over and over again, and we get better over and over again. And we get better because the daemon, our game player of the game, remembers what we did last time and guides us and helps us if it can, depending on how open the doors of perception and communication are between the daemon and the eidolon. The person that's living the life once is called an eidolon, by the way. So you then live the perfect life, and then you're allowed to move on. And This could be after hundreds or thousands of lives. Now, when you do this and you move on, I argue, but I can't do the science of this, whereas a lot of the other stuff I've just been explaining to you, I can do the science of.
Yes.
But the moving on bit, I can't. But what I believe happens is that you're allowed to come back into this life as a bodhisattva, as somebody who's here to help other people. And I've met 2 or 3 of these characters in my life. You know, the people that just have this kind of beautiful personality. They're so kind. They're so supportive. They're like a saint. And they come into your life.
I agree with you, because I would just like to add in, I've met such people as well who are, saints or monks from different religions, and you find a few that you get that feeling. There's a term in Eastern philosophy as avatar, which basically means that someone who's come back as, in a way, an enlightened person, and he's only here to help others. So whatever actions that person is doing is just to help others evolve. But you can see that person after multiple lifetimes has completely grown, developed, and become their truest, highest potential. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
And of course, the avatar is a wonderful term, because of course it's also a term of a synthetic body that you can go into, like the movie Avatar. So, there is a really interesting synergy and a linguistic interest here that I have in the use of language in terms of these terms. For instance, there is a wonderful play. I wrote a book on a little known in America English playwright come writer called Priestley. J.B. Priestley, and he wrote a play in 1937 called I Have Been Here Before. And try and get hold of a copy, or try and get hold of my book on J.B. Priestley, because I describe in great detail a number of his plays. And in this play, he has a character who is technically an avatar. And you have a scene of a play, and it's an inn up in the moors of Yorkshire in the north of England. And it's just one morning, and this guy turns up, a guy called Dr. Gortler, and he looks confused, and he goes, "Oh, I've got the wrong day. I've got the wrong time." And he goes, and he turns up later in the day, and you don't know what he's up to. And he acts very, very strangely. But as the story progresses, you realize he's somebody who's lived his life many, many times. And he's come back into that time to stop a young couple making a terrible mistake in their lives. And he's there to guide them. So again, we have this synergy of how my hypothesis can explain things. Now, very quickly, people should turn around to me and say, well, hold on a minute. We live the same life over and over again, and déjà vu is a memory of living that same life. But how can you explain past lives? How can you explain reincarnation within that scenario? And I can explain reincarnation within that scenario for one basic reason, is that, remember, I've mentioned the daemon, which is your game player, and your eidolon, which is all of us that live one life and then we die and we forget everything and we're reborn. Just like when you do a computer game, you start a new sprite on the screen every time you start a new game. It's the same equivalent. Yeah. And when you do play the game the next time, you remember what you did on the screen, in the on-screen environment, the game environment last time, and you use that knowledge to get yourself through the game. And I think that's what the daemon does with your life. But going back, so the daemon is effectively the memory and the consciousness, the awareness of all your previous lives. It carries all that knowledge. But of course, it only ever knows as much as far as you've got through the game. So it can only ever know. So if you die at 24 in the last life and previous lives, it doesn't know what happened after 24. So it can help you with its knowledge, but it can't guide you specifically on actions to take under certain circumstances. But that's a little bit of an aside. So I think that then there is another consciousness above that, which I call the Uberdaemon. And the Uberdaemon is the equivalent of what Carl Gustav Jung would call the collective unconscious. Mm-hmm. It's the idea that there is an entity or a form of consciousness that contains the memories of all humanity from the beginning of time. So that
you said a single consciousness.
It's a single consciousness, yeah, and it's a single consciousness, and it's aware of everything. Now, Jung very much argued this in his books, and he argued that this is why we recognize archetypes. This is why we recognize certain things and certain other locations in our lives, because if you go into the consciousness of that person, that entity, that's still you. So you are an eidolon, but you are also your daemon, but you're also the uberdaemon. So when you are hypnotized, or when you have past life reviews or past life flashes, what is in fact happening is your consciousness has bypassed the daemon and is attuning into the knowledge banks of the uberdaemon. In which case, you could suddenly then be in the body of a 17th century French peasant. It doesn't mean that French peasant was you, but in a sense, within the uberdaemon, it is you. You are everybody, okay? And this is why hypnotism works, because in hypnotism, people are very, very malleable. So they will go to a place to fulfill what the regressionist wants them to do. Now, I work with regressionists. I know 2 or 3 professional regressionists, and they totally agree with my hypothesis on this. They say they've got so much evidence from their work that my hypothesis is correct, because occasionally they come across the daemon. They'll hypnotize somebody and they won't go deep enough, and they get the daemon. And again, in earlier books, I've cited examples from hypnotism where this other version of the person comes to the fore, and it's more knowing, it's more knowledgeable, and it's quite dismissive of a lot of people because it knows these things. So then, you get the uberdaemon. But this is where I was really keen to talk to you guys, because a lot of my work is based on Vedanta, it's based on Buddhism, it's based on these things. Because if you then go to the next level above the collective unconscious, you get to what I call the Godamon. And the Godamon is the equivalent of Brahman. It's the equivalent of the ultra consciousness that is everything, the information field that everything emanates from. And within Vedanta, we know it as Brahman, because they say we're just a dream of Brahman, and when Brahman awakes, the universe stops.
This is an illusion. That's what they call Maya, right?
Maya, yeah. We're living within Maya. We're living within Kala chakras, sort of loops and going round, but also Maya. And Maya
Once we awaken, then we will know we are just Brahman, which is at one consciousness. We are pure the way we are right now.
And that is the major question, isn't it? To become aware. And this is what people are trained to do. This is what Buddhas are trained to do. This is what monks are trained to do, is to rise their consciousness up from the eidolon, which is ego, to the daemon, which is the superego, into the collective unconscious to find the God within. Now, again, the power of this, because it is a universal concept. It's not just because, again, there was a guy called Aldous Huxley in the 1950s came up with a concept called the perennial philosophy. And the perennial philosophy is basically what we're talking about. We are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, but we're individuated because we have egos. So
we have mind and body. So we're essentially different mind and bodies, but consciousness is one, singular.
And consciousness is one. Now, so the thing is as well, that when you get up to the level of the Godamon, you have concepts such as the Or Ein Sof, which is the concept in Kabbalah. The Gnostics have exactly the same concept. So this is clearly a universal. It's something we know subliminally. It's something that resonates with people when they discover it. But what I'm trying to do is to reduce it down and do the science and say, well, okay, so if there is a singular consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, what is the source of that single consciousness? And I'd argue the source of that single consciousness is the information field known as the 0 point field. And the 0 point field is a field of information that lies just above absolute zero in terms of temperature. It is the ground force of the universe. And science is discovering this now. And they're starting to discover that you can draw up elements of the this underlying 0 point field in substances called Bose-Einstein condensates. And Bose-Einstein condensates are effectively, I was explaining to your brother about subatomic particles and the way they can communicate instantaneously. Effectively, what Bose-Einstein condensates is an object, a load of molecules that are acting as one. They think as one, they move as one. They are a single entity. So it's analogous, again, to the daemon, the Godamon, and the uberdaemon. So we have analogies here within physics of how this works. And it's because we are all made of these objects. We are all made of subatomic particles that have been in existence since the first moments of the Big Bang. So we are literally embodied collections of immortal things that make up our physical body, which then embody this other reality, which is the non-physical reality of the 0 point field and 0 point energy. Now, I believe the 0 point field, we have evidence of where the 0 point field is on the information field. It's dark matter and dark energy, because we know that 94% of the universe is missing. We know this. And we don't know what dark energy is. We don't know what dark matter is. I argue that it's just equivalents of this. And everything basically is mathematical. Everything is numbers. And effectively...
But I really want to get I just thought of something, and this is something I feel like you would be a great person to have a discussion with. So in Advaita Vedanta, right, they essentially, there's a lot of texts like the Ashtavakra Gita that basically say that what we're living right now can be compared to as a dream, right? So when we are sleeping, when we're dreaming, right, everything seems so real. So when we are dreaming and that experience seems so real. And when you wake up, right, you remember your dreams sometimes for a few minutes. And a lot of times, like I've had dreams where, there's maybe 100 people in the dream if I'm in a shopping mall or something like that. But at the end of the day, the reality is there was only that one person who was dreaming, right? And when you wake up from this dream, you realize it wasn't true. There was nothing to be afraid of. So in Advaita Vedanta, they say that this is essentially a dream when you wake up, or like you said, become, a Buddha, or you get enlightened, and you realize that at the end of the day, this was not real or an illusion in a way. So, and how does the science have any explanation towards this, like the concept of dreams, right? I want to know.
Right. Dreams are something. I used to be a member of the International Association of the Study of Dreams, and I've written books on near-death experience. I've written books on out-of-body experiences and lucid dreaming. So I'm particularly interested in this. And I've only ever lucid dreamt once, which was extraordinary. Where suddenly I became self-aware in a dream that I was dreaming, and I was able to manipulate my environment. I was able to fly and everything else, and it was extraordinary. I'm working very closely now with a group of people who are researching, as I mentioned in the earlier section with your brother, working with hallucinogenic substances and dream-creating chemicals, for want of a better term. And I'm working with people who have out-of-body experiences, where they have veridical out-of-body experiences, where they share the experiences with somebody else and bring the information back. Now, this suggests to me that there are levels of reality, all of which are consciously generated, because effectively, if this is Maya is a brain-created illusion, but there are other nested hallucinations that we exist within, all of which are more real than this one. Now, again, people I know who have taken DMT, dimethyltryptamine, but specifically, which we didn't touch upon in the first section, 5-MeO-DMT. 5-MeO-DMT is similar to DMT, but whereas when somebody takes dimethyltryptamine, they keep their ego, they keep their eidolonic consciousness, as it were. They are aware of who they are. When somebody takes 5-MeO-DMT, something really curious happens. Now, 5-MeO-DMT is a very curious substance because it basically, it's found the excretions of the Sonoran desert toad, for instance, is one source of it, where the toad, when it's fearful, actually sweats this stuff. And I always wonder whether where the legend of kissing a frog comes from, to actually have extraordinary experiences or fall in love or whatever. But people who have taken 5-MeO tell me that you become ego-less. When you find yourself in this other reality, which is more real than this one and more real than the DMT state, you are at one with everything. I'm reminded of the word atonement. And I don't know if you know the roots of the word atonement.
No, could you talk about that?
It literally means at one-ment. It means to be at one-ment with everything. It's to meld yourself with the universal consciousness. And when you take 5-MeO, this is what you do. You realize that you are not individuated. That's an illusion. The individuation is an illusion.
The individual I, the ego, is an illusion.
Ego is an illusion. Yeah. It doesn't exist. It's something we have that our brain processes in order for us to function and exist within this Maya, using a proper technical term. I call it the Bohmian IMAX, but it's effectively the same concept. So you can do this using these chemicals. But the question I've always asked myself is, A, why have these chemicals evolved? Why are they there? Why are they there for us? And there's a wonderful story that was cited, I think, by Benny Shannon in his book called The Antipodes of the Mind. And it's fascinating. Do you know about ayahuasca?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I've had friends taken ayahuasca, and I've watched a few documentaries. So, but I hear experiences that, it was just amazing, and what they saw was just like ecstasy. They describe it as, but I don't know if there's.
And again, ecstasy, as I said to your brother, ecstasis is out of the body, which is literally what the word means. It was a great mystery, ayahuasca, because when the chemists and the anthropologists got down to the Amazon basin, they discovered that the chemical constituents of ayahuasca, and they discovered through the shamans and everything else, there was a mixture of two plants, Psychiatra viridas and Banisteria papsis capi. Okay, I never know which one is one. One of them contains DMT, and one of them contains another substance, which I'm going to touch on in a second. Now, they were intrigued as to how the shamans had discovered how to make this brew. For one fascinating reason, whichever of the two, I think it's the Psychiatra viridas, the leaves, which are one of the constituents of the brew, the ayahuasca. If you ingest and eat the leaves and chew them, the DMT is released. The DMT, the hallucinatory compound that causes the ayahuasca hallucinations, goes into your stomach, and it should cross into the into the bloodstream and cause hallucinations and experiences, but it doesn't. However many of the leaves you eat, and it doesn't for one very good reason, because when it gets into the stomach excretes something called monoamine oxidase. And monoamine oxidase, or MAO, is there to literally stop the hallucinogenic effects of the DMT. It nullifies the DMT and stops it getting into the bloodstream. However, if you mix Psychiatra viridas leaves with Banisteria apis capi leaves, something strange happens, because the Banisteria capi, the leaves of the Banisteria apis, contain something called harmaline or harmine. And harmine is an MAO inhibitor. It's a chemical that when it is ingested, when the MAO comes out of the lining of the stomach, it stops the MAO being effective. So it means that for ayahuasca to work, it needs both these substances to be together. So they turned around and they asked the shamans and said, hey guys, how did you know to mix these two plants? Because there are tens of thousands of different varieties of plants in the Amazon basin. And they turned around and they said, the plants told us, the entities told us. And they said what happened was, many years ago, the shamans would shamanic dance, drum and everything else to get into altered states of consciousness. But they wanted to get into altered states of consciousness easier without having to do all the drumming and the dancing, and to allow other people, non-shamans, to go into these states of consciousness. So when they were in shamanic traveling and they encountered entities in the worlds they went to, the higher world, as they would call it, we are the middle world, and there's the lower world and the higher world. When they were in the higher world, these entities would come to them, and they literally asked the entities, and they said, is there any way that we don't have to go through all those processes to get here? And they turned around and they said, we'll show you. And they took them into the jungle in this world, and they said, you pick this plant here, and you pick that plant there, and you put them together, and you will create a drink that you can use that will allow people to visit us. Now,
that's incredible. Wow. So that's so I need to talk to you about this, because I think you're going to maybe talk about what happens, like the experience of ayahuasca. So I don't know if you touched base on this, but in terms of the concept of parallel universes, right? I think in Eastern philosophy, it's called lokas or other realms or dimensions.
Like the Kali Loka, yeah.
Yeah, so like for example, this is planet Earth, right? But like you have more expertise in science. There's I don't know like how many galaxies are there? Like we don't even, know.
Oh, billions, trillions of galaxies, trillions.
So my question is that, and there's a lot of scriptures that talk about this as well, that there are parallel universes, that are like there's a text called Yog Vishisht, which basically talks about how that same person is essentially there in other dimensions as well at the same time. What what do you say about that? I know you touched a little bit about it, but
This is exactly, and it's spot on in terms of the stuff I write about. Yes, the many worlds interpretation. I think I explained it. I'm doing so many interviews these days. I'm not sure what I've said to who, but effectively, the many worlds interpretation was first suggested by Hugh Everett III, a PhD student of John Wheeler, way back in 1957, and effectively, in order to get over a real issue that some scientists had with the developing of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, particularly something called the Copenhagen interpretation of Niels Bohr and his associates, suggested that there was a direct relationship between the act of observation and reality, and that reality was basically brought into existence by the act of observation or the act of measurement, which clearly they didn't like. And Einstein made a famous quotation when he said, "I don't believe that the moon isn't there when I'm not looking at it." So Everett came up with an alternate idea. And I explained earlier to your brother exactly how it worked using Schrodinger's cat as the example. Yeah. But effectively, he argued that the universe splits into identical copies of itself trillions of times a second. In fact, every subatomic event brings about the creation of a new universe and has been doing so since the beginning of time. Now, if the universe is infinite, this is not at all a problem. If we have infinite universes, it doesn't matter. What do we mean by infinity anyway? There's different kinds of mathematical infinities. But so his argument is that literally there are trillions and trillions of versions of Amira and Anthony who are having this conversation now. And I say now because the question that is not just whether there are multiple universes, but also multiple times. Because effectively, time is a huge mystery. I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time a few years ago, and I said, which I mentioned earlier on, was featured as one of the books you had to read in the Times of India. And in this book, I argue that, that time is the only thing I know that we measure by itself. You can have a pound of apples, you can have all these things, but time is only a minute of a minute. You can only ever describe a minute by saying, well, it was a minute. It's a qualia again. You can't describe it. And John William Dunn, an Anglo-Irish aeronautical engineer in 1927, wrote a book called An Experiment with Time. And he came up with some wonderful analogies. He said, well, time, we know that time flows. It seems to flow past us. Now, does it flow past us or do we flow through it? And indeed, how do we know that time is flowing? And then he said, imagine a river with no riverbanks, and you're sitting in the river on a boat. How would you know that time was flowing? Because there's no riverbanks to give you the reference point of what it's flowing against. And he said, in order for us to know that time is flowing, there must be another form of time. And he called that, strangely enough, time 2. And he said, time 1 is the time we experience. Then time 2 is the time that time 1 flows against. And there's time 3 and time 4 and time 5. And he said, and then within each of those times, there is a version of you. An observer 1, which is in this time, an observer 2, an observer 3. Now, this means that time flows in different ways. But also, what I argue is that time can flow in a completely different way. Like we have normal time, which flows, there's the future out there, becomes the present, and then becomes the past. And the point that is moving is the now. And the now is the nexus point between the future, which hasn't happened, so it doesn't exist, and the past, which doesn't exist. So all that exists is the now. And we have no idea how big now is. It literally is probably the perception of us. So we then have the concept of the smallest bit of time you can have is called Planck time. And Planck time is the amount of time it takes a light wave to cross what's called the Planck length, which is the smallest bit of matter you can have. So it's infinitesimally small, but it does mean that time is quantized. It means that there's one Planck time and a next Planck time. So we are flowing through a series of individual times. But time flowing in that way, there's also a time that runs at right angles to this time, which is called orthogonal time. There's also something called block time, which Minkowski, Einstein's teacher, came up with. The time is in blocks. So suddenly we have nested universes, don't we? We have nested times, nested universes. Now, again, have you seen the movie Interstellar?
Yes, I've seen it. Yes, some time back.
Okay, there's a sequence in there called the Tesseract sequence. Now, a tesseract is also a hypercube. Now, what we mean by a tesseract is, and it's to do with how dimensions work, you have a point, you draw it out, you get a line. Okay? That's one dimension. You then draw from right angles from either side of the line, and you join them, you get a square, don't you?
Yes.
Then if you draw a line out from the corners of the square, you get a cube. That's three-dimensional space. Okay, we're all inside three-dimensional space. But you can then draw a line from all the points of three-dimensional space, and you create what's called a hypercube or a tesseract. And in Interstellar, that's the point he's trying to make. You know, they have the sequence where they're on, is it Palmer's planet or something, where the gravitational pull is so strong, 20 seconds on that planet is a year somewhere else. And we know that as a fact. The greater the gravitational pull, the slower time goes. So, in fact, your feet are actually older than your head because of gravity. Pure science. So the idea is that there are dimensions of space and dimensions of time that we can't perceive. And in the Tesseract sequence, do you remember, he is looking down at the life of his daughter, but he's seeing it from a location outside of space-time. So he's seeing all her life as a single moment where she's moving around. It's like a time-lapse photograph of somebody moving around in a room. And it's brilliant. And he's putting Christopher Nolan there. He's putting across so many concepts I write about. You know, he really is. This is why I believe that a lot of my hypotheses and ideas are already in the zeitgeist. People subliminally know that these are correct. So to cut a long story short, so it means that there are multiple universes, billions of universes, which means that every outcome of every decision you can possibly make is already there in one of the universes. There will be a version of you that will do everything that you can technically do in your life. But I argue, in my cheating the ferryman hypothesis, that when we are in the near-death state, we enter a state whereby we can follow any of those paths. And the day that God...
do we have free will, according to you? Or
Yes.
if every...
No, we do, because effectively, if you only live one life and it's an identical one to your previous life, which is what people like Nietzsche argued, you know, Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, this is very much the eternal returns, the eternal return. You can change it. There is free will. If there wasn't, you couldn't fulfill all these aspects. So yes, there is no free will outside of what is physically possible that you can do within your life. But within that, you have total freedom. Now,
right. That's what I like that you use the word freedom, because, you know, so we have the freedom in the now to make essentially the decision, right? Is that what you're referring to?
What we're doing at every moment, we are making decisions. You're making a decision now to sit here and continue the conversation, but there will be a version of you that will say, oh, Anthony Peake's a complete nut job, and walked off. There's another one where you decide that you'll pick up that ornament and smash the computer screen. Theoretically possible. So there's a variation of that where you will do that. So all of them exist. I mean, there's been a movie recently called All Things at All Times or something, Everything Everywhere Now. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's a Korean movie, I think. Check it out, because this is exactly what it's talking about. There's so many movies that do this. I mean, you know, it's a...
Matrix was amazing. The Matrix movie was amazing. I loved it.
No, The Matrix is talking about exactly the same things. And again, you know, as a classic example, you know, movies that I cite, you know, there's a movie called Triangle that talks about it. Of course, Vanilla Sky, Tom Cruise. He's living his life again in a dream. You know, and
Inception was also a good one.
Inception is incredible. The levels, again, in Inception, the levels of time, the way in which, you know, the things, the coach is falling off. Again, and that's Christopher Nolan again. You know, so the idea that, you know, that that time is relative, and at the different levels of dream states, time gets broader, which it does. We know that when, again, in my book, The Labyrinth of Time, I talk about how in dream states, time dilates. But time dilates anyway. We know scientifically time dilates because time and space are the same thing. So when we think about space, we think about it as being space. But the faster you go and the faster you get to the speed of light, space becomes time and time becomes space. So, for instance, if you are moving, time goes slower, or is it faster? I can never remember, than somebody who's not moving or not moving relative to you. There are different times. So time itself is the clue to this. And this is why I argue that at the moment of death, you can live your life 1,000,000 times in the final second of your life because you're in a different form of time. Now, again, and this is fascinating, there is an American quantum physicist called John Kramer. And John Kramer has an amazing hypothesis that I've adopted to make it even more amazing. He argues that there are two types of time waves or waves of matter. There are what's called retarded and advanced waves. And I'm never sure which is which, but I think it's advanced waves are going forward in time, from the past to the future. And retarded waves are going from the future to the past. Okay? And I argue that when they meet is the present moment. And when they meet, when you put two waves together, you get what's called an interference pattern. And I think the present moment is literally at the interface of these two waveforms. And that's what we perceive as we travel through whatever we're traveling through. But of course, at the level of higher levels of consciousness, these things change. You know, because we know that time slows down. We know, I'll say, there'll be people out there that have had accidents. You know, when you have an accident, suddenly time goes zzz. And they've done experiments. A guy called David Eagleman has been doing experiments on this for years, where what they do is they actually have somebody stand on a high platform and they've got a watch, and the watch has got time running, a digital watch really fast, and they jump off. And as they're falling, the watch slows down slightly so they can see the number. Now, this is extraordinary, and I've argued that the problem with Eagleman's experiment and why it doesn't work, why they can't quite get the numbers, they see it slowing down but can't quite get it, is a very important point. They know they're not going to die. So when they jump off, they know that they've got things that will save them. But I'll guarantee if you pushed somebody off there and they didn't know, they would see it slow down completely. Because the daemon will know the person's about to die. And when the daemon knows that, it takes you out of this time and puts you into orthogonal time, or puts you into another form of time. So yes, we have multiple lives, and this is a simulation.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I've recently I've been reading some work from Donald Hoffman as well, and he's also
great.
Space and time being an illusion, and the theory of us living in a simulation.
But just to make the point here, I know it's wonderful, and Donald Hoffman is getting an awful lot of kudos, and people are loving his work. I've been writing about this for 20 years, way before Donald Hoffman.
Whatever you talked about now it's just, and I think the last thing I want to talk about is, so your theory of us living multiple lives and being here before. So the only question is, okay, I get it. We're here to evolve and, become our truest potential, to become, the Buddha, to become enlightened. But why, where, and when did this ignorance start from? Like, if our true nature is that we are Brahman and that we are pure, that is our essence, why have we forgotten that, and hence are, making mistakes or are doing things in ignorance, and hence have to come back and forth to kind of improve that? And I was reading about this term called, I think it's infinity regress, where it essentially means that, like, there's no way to calculate it because it's just going to go back to infinity. But I want to know your thoughts on it to kind of end.
Yeah, the idea here is the person that really came up with a similar idea to my own. By the way, the computer screen keeps going off. That's why I have to keep turning off the light. It's Alan Watts was somebody that first came up with this interesting concept, which I've developed and in much more scientific ways than he did. But Watts argued, I'll just explain my version of this, is that you're God, you're the Orain Sof, you're Brahman, you exist forever. That's bloody boring, isn't it? You're just an essence. You're just there, and you're going to be there forever. So what do? You create your own soap opera. You create planets with people and entities and beings and animals. And then what do? You then go, right, I now want to experience being a mere aurora. So what God does is he literally suffers from what's called amnesis. It's what the ancient Greeks called amnesis, forgetting. And
Alan Watts' story, yeah. That we're all God. We decide to play. Alan Watts says that story, right? That we decided to play, and God, being God, forgot who he was, and now we're here.
Correct. And what you do is you embody yourself as Anthony Peake or Amora Aurora, and you go into that, and then you forget deliberately who you are, so you can experience it viscerally and in time. And then you live all of Amira Aurora's lives, all the alternatives, being helped by the daemon. And then you'll come along and you'll go, right, I now want to be Anthony Peake. I now want to be a...
Yeah. I was just thinking about this yesterday, about this entire thing, that it makes sense. It's just like, okay, so let's say a child is born blind, for example. So why would Brahman or God want to experience that? And then I was kind of reading about it, and I found out that I guess in a way for Brahman or for God, there is no good or bad in that sense, because for them, it's just situations or experiences. But we have conditioned ourselves to know that, oh, this is good, this is bad, this is sad, this is happy, in a way.
But there's a very important caveat I put on there as well, because one of the major critiques in the past of my hypothesis that we live our lives over and over again is, what about a child who is born with some kind of terrible congenital illness and dies after 6 weeks? What happens to them within the model? Surely your model is incredibly cruel. The first point I say to that is, well, I didn't create it. It just seemed to be the scientists telling me this is what's happening. But I genuinely believe I can deal with that, because remember I was talking about the many worlds interpretation, and that the outcome of everything that is. Now, if you live your life multiple lives, it means that effectively, if in the future you have children, or if you have children, that the circumstances by which you have those children will be different every time in every life you have, because you might in one life choose to go and live in Australia. You might choose a different spouse, maybe, which could be interesting in terms of the DNA there. But effectively, our worlds are all dependent upon the decisions made by our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. Now, on top of that, imagine a scenario where the daemon and the uber daemon are the same. Imagine a scenario with uber daemons. Imagine that the uber daemon lives its life and makes many decisions. It effectively means that every civilization will be different, because every civilization is a collection of eidolons, collection of daemons, and a collection of uber daemons. And that means that people will make different decisions right through history, which means there will be a civilization somewhere that child would not be born with this congenital illness, because that society's already eradicated it. It's just that in this version of the civilization, that child dies, which is tragic. But there will be, with guidance, that child will be reborn in a civilization or a scenario where their illness didn't kill them. And then they will thrive within that, which means that suddenly tragedy is not such a tragedy anymore. It suddenly means that there's opportunity for everybody.
Yeah, I asked Swami Sivapriyananda. He's also my Vedanta teacher, and he's been on the podcast a couple of times. When I asked him about this, that because he essentially is talking about what you're talking about, but more on the side of Eastern philosophy. and not scientifically. But I asked him then that, okay, then where does, suffering play a role, or, why is there suffering then? And he says, of course, in the Eastern philosophies, usually the most popular concept is the theory of karma, right? Karma doing its role and all. But he says kind of the one that he believes in, and kind of what we're talking about is that who is asking suffering, or who is the one suffering? Ask yourself, who am I? And when you realize you're not the mind, body, ego complex, and you are Brahman, or that pure consciousness, that question of suffering, like you said, that experience of tragedy will not really be that tragedy in the way that we think of it now with our conditioned, mind and intellect.
I think that's very true, and I think that's the major issue, is misinterpreting this in many ways. But that is the concept. Of karma is what you did in your previous life will carry through and will change you in this life. Now, Cheating the Ferryman doesn't argue that, because Cheating the Ferryman says that you're you. So you don't change the karma you carry with you. Because for me, the question of multiple lives is in order to learn and in order to grow. But if you take the classic example of reincarnation, you're born and you don't remember what you did last time. So what's the point? What's the point? If you can't learn from your mistakes because you don't know you made the mistakes, you can never better yourself. You have to be aware in some way. If karma is to work, you have to be aware that in some way you're being punished for what you did in a previous life. I would argue that Cheating the Ferryman is a far more elegant explanation of what is taking place. And then if you go further into the karma thing, you then go up into the Godamon and everything else. But to me, to have a child suffer from what another completely different consciousness did is awful. And of course, it means it's an excuse then for the caste system, and it's an excuse for keeping certain castes down, like the untouchables, forever, because it's their fault that they are untouchables. And it's because what they've done in previous lives.
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to end this, but I wanted to ask you one last question, because it's something that's kind of in my mind when you're talking about it. So when, in your theory, right, I think I was able to understand it.
My hypothesis, it's not a theory.
Hypothesis. Yeah. But it's a wonderful, so it's, the only question I have is when you're saying about us coming back in multiple lifetimes, and right, it's the same consciousness, right? But is a person the same in the sense that, do they look the same, or they're the same, color of skin, or like, does that have to remain the same, or can we come back in a different form?
That's the point I was making earlier, that if you take the many worlds interpretation and apply that to it, it means that you can come back as you. But if your parents were different, or your grandparents to make a different decision, you'd be different. But effectively, you always come back as you. And in the immediate lives after you die now, you will come back as you. And you will come back as you at this time, in this time. And your daemon will remember what you did in this time. But there will be versions of you within the macroverse that you will look physically different, because your parents may have met in a different time, a different place. There's also an interesting argument that's just come up recently on my YouTube channel, which is a very interesting one, which me and my little group have been debating for years, is that when you come back, do you come back at the point of birth, or can you come back at a particular point in your life, like you can do in a computer game? Because, in a computer game, you can save it at that point and start it again at that point, rather than going back to the beginning. And I can't see any reason why you can't. I can't see any reason why you can't, because if it's all digital information, it doesn't matter. So it works for me, and it reflects an awful lot of the science. The science works. The science really does work. I've only touched upon the deeper science. When I go into the neurochemistry, I go into the brain science, I go into split brain operations, lots of things.
Yeah, I love that. I'm so happy that, because I've been wanting to get a guest who has a knowledge of course, Eastern philosophy and spirituality, but really has a scientific background on it. So this was amazing. And thank you for clarifying earlier about my point, because in, for example, Advaita Vedanta, right, the whole concept of reincarnation, it's really critical that the consciousness is what comes back. So it's not like you're going to change consciousness, right? Which is, I think, what you're saying as well, that it's not that you died and the consciousness changes and comes back. The you is consciousness, so that has to remain permanent that's coming back. Yeah, that's
Correct.
beautiful. Yeah, and I agree with that. It was such an honor, Anthony, for having you. I will link your books and your work in the description when we release this podcast in 2 parts. You are a house full of wisdom, and honestly, like the reason was so intrigued by your work and me studying Vedanta in my personal life is because this is really the only knowledge that can really liberate you at the end of the day. There's nothing else that's going to give you that permanent comfort or satisfaction or happiness that we're seeking besides this ultimate truth. We're always going to come back to that point, even in the material world, that you're going to realize that things are not working out. You're not happy. What next? Or you've achieved everything and you're still not happy, right? So this is the ultimate question of life. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for being able to share this.
You're welcome. It's been wonderful. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.